First, we discuss Renaissance critic Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney is thought an embodiment of aristocratic ideals of Renaissance man. Sidney was a courtier, soldier, statesman, scholar, poet. He is author of the first English sonnet sequence. He wrote the first landmark of literary criticism in English, that is called A Defense of Poetry. In 1579, a Puritan minister and a failed poet, Stephen Gosson, published an attack on the theatre titled The School of Abuse. Stephen Gosson dedicated it without permission to the right noble gentleman, Master Philip Sidney. So Sidney countered the following year with his defense, that is called an apology for poetry, sometimes called a defense of poetry. So that's his critical work that has many, you can say, merits in English history. First, that is thought the first defense of English poetry. Second, it is thought defense of nationalist English literature. Third, it is believed that classical ideas actually represented through poetics, they are redefined, republished, reissued through Philip Sidney's work. More or less, Sidney's work, A Defense of Poetry or An Apology for Poetry, is derived one. It's not original one. I mean to say, what he has said about poetry and its function, that has been actually mentioned in the works of classic critics like Aristotle and afterwards Horace. Even then, it is thought highly significant because it is a work of an English author that defends the legitimate place of poetry, though An Apology for Poetry responds to specific attacks. The apology enjoys significance far beyond its occasion for its synthesis of Renaissance understanding of classical literary theory. That is its significance. It shows Renaissance understanding of classical literary theory. पहले हम ये पढ़ चुके हैं कि Renaissance age had interest in revival of classical knowledge, revival of classical arts, revival of classical learning. So that is an attempt to understand classical literary theory, which set the terms of literary debate in England for the next 2 centuries. Sidney adapted it from classical and medieval models. Because Stephen Gosson's attack draws so heavily on Plato's objections to poetry. Yesterday I mentioned Plato's objections to poetry, and these are actual objections which have been, you can say, reproduced by critics of poetry in different eras, including Renaissance critic Stephen Gosson. Sidney's apology reads like a reply to the Republic. Mean, though immediate counterpart was Gosson's attack, but between the line that responds to Republic ideas. So, as Gosson's work relies upon Republic's objections to poetry or Plato's objections to poetry, Sidney's defense relies upon Aristotle's defense of poetry. Sidney relies particularly on Aristotle's poetics and our Latin or Roman critic Horace Ars Poetica. Sidney's remarks on the state of the English language and its poetry would define the significant literary issues for later English critics like John Dryden, Aphra Behn in the 17th century, and Samuel Johnson in the 18th century. Sidney was Sidney was greatly admired both in England and on the continent of Europe for his sophistication and learning. He was for several years unable to find employment and court. He belonged to the faction led by his uncle Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, one of Queen Elizabeth's favorites. He divided his time between visits with his illustrious friend, among them the poet Edmund Spenser, and his own writing. When he fell out of favor with the Queen, he retreated to his sister's estate and began to work on Old Arcadia, also known as the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia, because Countess of Pembroke was his sister. Arcadia is a pastoral romance alternating prose and poetry. Mean both genres have been used in this work, though it is dominantly a prose work, but it includes pastoral poetry. Two sonnet sequence followed, certain sonnets and Astrophil and Stella. He also began but did not complete a revision of the Arcadia. An apology for poetry is a classic statement of Renaissance literary theory, primarily because of its scope, its typicality, and its grace and clarity. Unlike his English contemporary, George Puttenham, Sidney displays little interest in formulating the technical rules of poetry or technical rules of rhetoric. He treats the subject of poetry much more broadly. He is a synthesizer. Synthesizer means who synthesizes, you can say, different ideas. An apology is an encyclopedia of Renaissance humanism, though structured as a classical oration with the standard 7 parts. What are the 7 parts of apology for poetry? These are exordium, proposition, division, examination, refutation, digression, and peroration. I repeat, these are the standard 7 parts of classical oration, which includes exordium, proposition, which means thesis statement, division, examination, refutation, digression, and peroration. Sidney's text is more usefully understood as treating 3 major topics. First part defends the dignity of poetry. demonstrating its superiority to philosophy and history because it combines the moral precepts of the one with the entertaining example of the other. Most important sentence of today's lecture is this: Sidney defends the dignity of poetry and he believes that poetry is superior to philosophy and history. Reason is that, according to Sidney, philosophy presents abstract ideas, but it does not offer concrete examples. So it fails to influence or motivates the readers. Only, you can say, the intellectual elite can take part in philosophical discourse. Rest of the people cannot enjoy philosophical abstract concepts. So he thinks in poetry, ideas are presented through tangible, concrete form. So they are not only effective, mean abstract ideas are effective, but these ideas are highly significant when they work for moral inspiration. Second, he believes that poetry is superior to history. In history, he thinks that examples are there, but because of certain constraints of history subject, learners cannot understand them because it tries to present history uh, showing a commitment to facts rather than moral standards, rather than philosophical ideals. So philosophical ideas, political and moral ideals, they need a better explanation, and that is not found in history. It is seen through literature or poetry. Poetry combines the moral precepts of history, precepts of philosophy with the entertaining example of history, all the while cloaking its lesson with the pleasurable devices of art. Cloaking its lesson means it is not a dry subject like philosophy. It tries to present these moral ideals or didactic lessons through stories, characters. These are pleasurable devices. Along the way, Sidney discusses the ethics of genres, ranging from pastoral we have discussed many times, or that is that deals with natural landscape, rural setting, and human feeling or spontaneous feeling in the company of nature. Among Renaissance writer, Sidney's Arcadia and Edmund Spencer's Shepherd's Calendar are best example of pastoral poetry. Elegy is the poem written on the death of someone, and satire to comedy, tragedy, and epic. Second part deals with the specific objections. So first part is defense of dignity of poetry. After its comparison with history and philosophy, then advantageous position of poetry and its genres which are more effective and influential than philosophy and history. Second part deals with the specific objections raised against poetry, in particular the charges the poet is a liar. These are objections which have a history from Plato to Stephen Gasson. Sidney follows Boccaccio on this point. Boccaccio is an Italian writer, a forerunner of Renaissance, famously declaring, "No, for the poet, he nothing affirms and therefore never lies." We can say that is the position, that's the stance of Boccaccio, which is recounted by Philip Sidney. Idea is that not, poet nothing affirms, therefore never lied. क्योंकि शायर किसी मौकफ की तायद नहीं करता, वो मुख्तलिफ किस्म के मौकफ जो हमारे सामने रखता रहता है, तो उसके किसी बात को सच और झूठ की उस डेफिनेशन पर पूरा नहीं लिया जा सकता. Poetry is pack of lies, that's an objection that has a tradition, you can say, starting from Saint Augustine to present day critics, but it it is defended in this way that poet nothing affirms, therefore never lies. Poets' imitations are not lies because poets make no truth claims. The third part of the essay examines the current state of English literature. That is a very significant, that is the point that makes it, you can say, a nationalist work, a nationalist criticism that comments on Elizabethan theatre and Elizabethan poetry. Here, Sidney, the practicing poet, offers some critical comments on diction, poetic figures, meter, rhyme, rhythm, and English vernacular compared to other languages. That topic, to discuss English vernacular, comparing it with other European languages like French, Italian, German. Of particular interest is Sidney's pointed criticism of the English drama for failing to adhere to the unities of time and place sketched in Aristotle's Poetics. According to Sidney, that is the flaw of Elizabethan theatre, but we have discussed in several, you can say, topics that that's the merit of English drama, that it does not stick to the idea of unity. This issue would occupy neoclassical critics of the drama from Barry Cornell through Samuel Johnson. A fundamental aesthetic problem of late 16th century concerns the object and purpose of poetry's representation. Sidney's definition of poetry sets an agenda for the discussion of poetry that brings together many of the learned commonplaces of Renaissance criticism. He defines poetry is an art of imitation. We can smell that is very like Plato and Aristotle. That is to say, are representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth, to speak metaphorically, a speaking picture. According to Sidney, poetry is a speaking image, or poetry is a speaking picture with this end to teach and delight. Always remember Sidney's definition of poetry. Poetry is a speaking picture which aims to teach and delight. This definition is less notable for its originality because it is drawn almost word for word from the Italian-born humanist Julius Caesar Scaliger's Poetics, and ultimately its origin can be traced in Aristotle's Poetics. Definition and Sidney's subsequent discussion of it raises three issues, all derived from Plato's discussion of poetry that dominate literary criticism until the end of 18th century. Nature of imitation, problem of defining nature, and the injunction that poetry serve moral ends. ये डिबेटेबल पॉइंट्स हैं कि क्या पोइट्री को किसी मॉरल एंड को सर्व करना चाहिए कि नहीं करना चाहिए, बट सिडनी बिलीव्स दैट पोइट्री हैज a dual function of entertaining the readers, delighting the reader, as well as teaching the readers. Critics of the apology, especially modern ones, have argued that it is derivative that Sidney is simply not an original theorist, and that the rhetorical play and intertextual abundance of his Renaissance prose is tiring. Yet, so long as contemporary literary theorists as Jacques Derrida, Richard Rorty, and Donna Harvey are still debating the status of nature and ideological stakes involved in representation. So,